All right, guys, welcome back. Sorry, I got distracted for 2 minutes. So, nice to see everybody again. This is still shocking how many people we have 4 weeks in. So, this is week 4. We'll see how tonight goes. Potentially at the end, I think I would like to do a 5th class, but we can see how many people are interested or have, next week open at the end of class. We can talk about that. So. If we do a 5th class, next week would be less about apologetics and theology and much more about addressing some contemporary cultural issues that you're going to face if you go to college that we should all probably know more about and be able to discuss in secular society. So things like critical race theory, secular abortion arguments, the whole transgender LGBTQ plus, movement that's going on. So those are ideas that I'm thinking about talking about. Mike wants you to talk about a few of those. So we'll see at the end. So before we hop into this week, I want to do a review as always. The first 2 classes, right, we were building up arguments for the existence of God, and we were building up arguments for the existence of big G God, right? The theistic God. So we learned last week about the, different views of isms, theism, pantheism, deism, and atheism, right? We were making arguments largely the first few weeks for the existence of a theistic God, and we weren't necessarily arguing through, Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, right? So I'll title those types of arguments top-down arguments. You start with arguments that a big G God exists, you lock in that fact, and then we can look at the evidence and the arguments between the faiths to pick which faith most accurately fits with the evidence of what we have for the big G God we've established, right? So we're working down from big G God. Last week is something I would call a bottom-up argument. So last week we learned all about the reliability of the testimony of the New Testaments and all the evidence, the historical evidence we have out there for the resurrection of Jesus, even outside of the Bible, right? So the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is strong enough that many people who debate or have philosophical arguments with secular people or people of other religions and Christianity will actually use the resurrection of Jesus for an argument for the existence of God, right? So that what we learned last week was that Jesus claimed to be God, Jesus rose from the dead, therefore Jesus is God, therefore God exists. You can make an argument for the existence of God based on the resurrection of Jesus. So it's kind of arguing from the bottom up. We can start with a proof that Christianity is true because Jesus rose from the dead. The ability to rise from the dead would only come from God, so we can use that as a proof to say, therefore, God exists. Everybody understand the difference, like top down, bottom up? So anyway, I thought that was interesting. You'll actually hear that as an argument for the existence of God in a lot of debates if you ever get into listening to theists debate atheists or theists of different religions debate each other. You'll hear the argument for Jesus' resurrection as evidence for the existence of God a lot. So that's all I wanted to cover in a review. So this week, we're going to be covering a pretty heavy set of philosophical topics. I can't help it. This is going to be kind of like class 1. People have been arguing over the philosophy of ethics and morality forever. There are definitely some hard topics in here. We're going to spend the whole first half of the class on morality in general, and then I'll transition and try to spend the last third of the class maybe on pain and suffering. So how do we logically situate ourselves in the state of affairs we see around us in the world and in the universe, right? So first, we're going to start with the moral argument. This is an argument, it's another top-down argument, just like class 1. This is an argument for big G God existing. It's a very contentious argument. Not a lot of people find it very persuasive. I think people who are already of a theistic bent find it very persuasive. I'm going to jump to the end. So remember in class 1 with the cosmological argument, at the end of the day, you had a choice to make, right? It's the same thing here. We're going to walk our way to that choice at the end, and I'll prove to you that that choice is the true choice. But we're going to find out that if God does not exist, there is no rational way to hold on to the belief that morals exist at all. That's the end. That's where you're going to be left at the end of the class. Yeah?
I'm not saying I disagree with you, but what if someone would come back and say, well, society created this?
Which society?
Like each culture, independent culture.
Yeah, so we're going to cover that. What you're left with then is morality based on force. Because if I can kill everybody, then I get to decide what morality is, right? Is that true morality? Is morality whoever can survive in a physical altercation? Because that's what you're left with. If you say, well, societal norms, we're going to cover this later, but if societal norms are what establish morality, then you could have a society that conquers the world and kills everyone who disagrees with them, and then their societal norms are what we would say is moral truth. It's a really easy example in the 20th century where we could have foreseen that happening, right? What if we were all blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and there were no people of other colors because they were all dead, and everybody who grew up in that world thought that that was right? Would that make the genocide of all those people moral? Okay, right? So we're going to cover exactly those topics. So the moral argument in its simplest form goes like this. A lot of people don't like this form. If you did the homework, I sent you a much more confusing video with a more complicated argument, but there's a reason that I like the more complicated argument better. It's actually a set of 3 videos. I didn't send you the first 2. The first 2 establish why they think moral realism is true, and then they use moral realism in the argument for the moral argument ending in God. But I'll say this one is sufficient for our class. So if God does not exist, you have no external standard by which to judge better or worse in the terms of good versus evil. We all intrinsically feel that there is such a thing as good and evil. Therefore, this outside standard we're pointing to as goodness, we're going to define that as God. So that's why this is an argument for big G God, not necessarily Christianity, right? We're defining God as this perfect standard of moral goodness outside of fallen human nature, which we all have internally, right? So this is the idea of moral realism. So I wanted to cover realism at first. We didn't talk about this at all because it almost doesn't even bear talking about. But there are people who are non-realists. So realism is part of your presuppositions. We go back to class 1, right? You got foundational building blocks that your house is sitting on. You don't even realize. Remember I called them properly basic beliefs? And one of all of our properly basic beliefs in this room, I'm willing to bet everyone has the same one, is that the world you're experiencing in front of you actually exists. This would be realism. And by actually exists, I mean to say that the universe exists whether or not there's an observer to perceive it existing. So we know the vast majority of the known universe is lifeless. If we were to get in nuclear war next year and make the human race extinct and there were no more intelligent life beings to observe the universe, we all believe in this room that the universe is a real thing and would go on existing until God decided to not make it exist. There are people who are non-realists, right? That's when I keep referring to this joke about being in the simulation or the matrix, or that you're all figments of my imagination. All my perceptions of touch and emotion are figments of my imagination, and when I die, you guys don't exist anyway. You disappear because you're just perceptions of my imagination, right? So realism is the idea that things exist whether or not you're around to see them. They're there. So we take that idea. What we're arguing for with the moral argument is that moral realism exists, being that actions or dispositions, so how you approach someone, right, are truly virtuous or vicious regardless of whether or not anyone thinks that they are. I can't take an act that is truly evil, run around and kill everyone in the world who thinks it's evil and leave only the people who don't think it's evil, and change that act from vicious to virtuous because there's no longer anyone around who thinks that it's vicious, right? That there actually is a moral standard for good and evil outside of people's opinion or moral or majority opinion, right? So this is the idea of moral realism, and that's what the moral argument is arguing for. Any questions on realism, moral realism? Things exist outside of you, your opinion, your perceptions of your senses. All right. So that leads us to only two possibilities. The first one, which is the camp we're all in, is objective morality. So you kind of view these as synonyms, right? Objective morality is the belief that moral realism is true. You know, they're kind of back and forth, the same thing. So you're left with either objective morality or subjective morality. Does everybody know what the terms objective versus subjective mean? When you're in grade school, your teacher generally says, you know, objective is fact, subjective is opinion, right? Subjective, the root word is the subject, so the outcome is determined only by the subject who holds the opinion, right? It's a determination that's wholly dependent on the subject who's making the determination. Versus objective, we all know what an object is. This is an object. So going back to this idea of realism, right? The determination is based in an outside object that is not determined by a subject, me, an agent. This is a object, non-agent. I'm an agent, I make decisions and have opinions and I'm whimsical, and this is not, it's a thing that exists. So objective morality is a thing outside of us subjects. This is the biggest argument that comes up against this, is whether or not moral facts and duties actually exist. And the most paradoxical thing is that this is how absolutely everyone acts in the real world. If you don't believe me, try to cut somebody in line, steal something from them, slap them in the mouth. You've all felt that internal feeling of being wronged, right? That there are things that people ought not do to you, right? He shouldn't do that to me. So there's this very rich history of the idea of oughts versus is statements. So an is statement is just a statement of observed fact. It's observational. Things are this way, and you're not making a judgment whether they're good or bad. And oughts are statements where you're saying, well, it would be better if you did it this way, and worse if you did it this way. And what ought statements imply is a relativity, right? It's relative to something. I'm either closer to something or further away from that something. Like definitionally, if I'm saying that you should or ought to do something because it would be better or worse with respect to what? So there's a multi-hundred-year philosophical discussion that established that use of the word ought or should only makes rational sense with respect to a goal or a purpose. I can't say Isaac ought to run fast for it to have any rational meaning. I say, if Isaac wants to win the race, Isaac ought to run fast. So with respect to the goal of winning the race, he ought to run fast and not slow. But what's the goal or purpose that we are referring to when we say, you ought not take my lunch money, Mr. Bully at school, right? In order to affirm that there are better or worse ways to act as a human, which everyone does, you have to affirm, most often you're doing this implicitly without knowing it, you're affirming that there is a goal or a purpose to human beingness, like why humans exist, right? You're either doing something that's towards that purpose or contrary to that purpose. Without a purpose or a goal in mind, all you can say is that he stole my lunch money. Not that he shouldn't have or should have, he did. It's just something that happened, right? So, oughts require purpose. Philosophers of all ilks agree with that, whether or not they agree that moral facts and duties exist. They agree that Isaac ought to run fast if he wants to win the race. That ought makes sense if you have a purpose in mind. Where the question comes down is, do humans have a purpose in their existence? If not, it should be the very famous David Hume's, the philosopher, atheistic philosopher from right around 1400, I think. His position was, well, there is no purpose to the existence of mankind, and therefore we cannot make rational ought statements about their moral actions. There are no such thing as rational moral actions. And that's kind of where you're left, and we're going to build that as we go through the subjective morality, okay? But objective morality is what makes sense to most people. You need a standard bearer by which to judge whether you're doing something that's better or worse, right? So if to make a very simple analogy, and I'm not original with this analogy. If you're a guy carrying a football, right? There is no way to describe what you're doing as better or worse until you make a goal for him to go through, right? Without an objective standard outside of himself pointing in the direction of which way is best, which way we're striving to be, it becomes meaningless which way he chooses to go. So this is the idea of objective morality. In order for things like the most heinous things you can imagine, so some of which I'll forego mentioning for young ears, but in order for those things to be wrong at all, we have to have a standard for what is perfect and right. This is what we rely on God for. God is our external standard that is perfect goodness by which we measure whether actions are closer to being like God or further away from being in the nature of God. Okay? So, I don't want to spend more time on this because I think we'll flesh it out more in the second half of the class. What I really want to spend a lot of time is if you don't have God as an external standard, you can't rationally hold that there is such a thing as morality at all. So, the first argument you're going to get here from anybody is due to a misunderstanding of two complicated philosophical terms. Epistemology versus ontology. Sorry I got to do this to you, but it's important. These come from two Greek words, episteme and ontos. So everybody knows ology is the study of. So if you study biology, it's the study of bios. If you, all the ologies. So epistemology is the study of knowing, how you know something, and ontology is the study of being. These can get complicated, but the primary refutation you're going to hear about is if you don't have God, then morality doesn't exist, is people saying, are you saying that I can't be moral if I don't believe in God? And that is not true. So someone can be moral or act morally or commit moral acts. They might even hold and know some moral truths as true and be an atheist and reject the idea that God exists. This is epistemology. This is how you know, right? Someone might know, so knowing moral truths is this one. And it does not, you do not need God, I say belief in, you can learn or come to know in many ways. So some of these are written on your heart. Some could be societal. Heck, we can even give them evolution. Doesn't matter. How you come to know that stealing from someone is wrong does not require belief in God. I can know that something is wrong without needing to believe in God. It could be arbitrary how I learned it. Like I might think some moral things are moral and they're actually amoral. And then I could think other things are moral and I might just be right by happenstance that those things are moral. But I can be a moral actor without believing in God. The point I'm going to make next is that ontologically, God existing is necessary for us to even have the idea of moral or amoral. I don't need to believe in God to know some moral things are true. I can't establish anything as moral or amoral without God in the picture. So that's what we're going to talk about next, and that's called the ontology of moral truth. I know this is getting complicated, I can tell, but the reason I bring this up is if you go listen to some of the debates that are in the additional resources, there's a few debates that are actually based on the moral argument. The actual debate is on the moral argument, and as we'll learn towards the end of class, with a lot of emotional fervor, the pushback you're going to get is on the epistemological side, is on the side that you're saying that only religious people can be good. Look at all these religious people who are evil. Look at all these secular and atheistic people who are good, right? We're not talking about who is better at being moral or amoral, whether or not you can be moral and refute the idea that God exists, whether people who believe in God and prescribe to moral truths are actually good at living up to those moral truths, right? Those are all arguments that are actually not what we're talking about. We're talking about whether you can actually deem something moral or not requires an absolute standard by which to measure all things, and that is God. Okay. Because you're going to, as we get to the end of this, that's the most common emotional issue, or a very powerful, misleading argument is mankind's ability to live up to truths, even if they're truths that they believe in, right? So anyway, so that takes us to subjective morality. And I'm definitely probably going to end up on a soapbox here at some point in time with this one. So one, I said objective morality is how everyone acts in their daily life. You have felt wronged at some point probably this week, maybe even today. You've definitely done things that you yourself have felt guilty for, right? And this is true of non-theists. I mean, outside of a small group of people who are true psychopaths, right? Everyone feels as though there are things that are moral and amoral. The argument today is that these things that we feel internally as objectively good or bad are actually a production of Darwinistic evolution that we learned about last week. And the reason we think stealing is wrong, or rape is wrong, or murder is wrong is because those things are detrimental to society, right? Society has done better when those things don't exist, and therefore the species proliferates more, and therefore the people who proliferate in that society all intrinsically start to learn that these things are bad, right? They're just bubbled up from the ground up through evolution, right? The problem with that is that could be the case. I mean, we go back to last week and focus on the problems of Darwinistic evolution again. But the problem with that is that there's no justification. That's the problem, right? That might be true, but how, if evolution is the only way that they came about, do I rationally justify that it should be this way instead of it just is this way? Because as we learned last week, Darwinian evolution, all it really says is what survives is what proliferates. It doesn't say that what survives is what's best. It says what survives is what survives is best definitionally because it proliferated, right? It's like a circular argument in evolution. You are best because you proliferated. Therefore, if you proliferate, you are best, right? They're one and the same. It's like a tautology is the word for that. So subjective morality, what people are trying to do in secular society today is build a moral standard that does not need God. And the problem is justification. So last class when I wrote it on the board, we talked about atheism, with a synonym wrote beside it called humanism, which you can read as desire for human flourishing. So when you listen, this is very, has anybody ever heard of Sam Harris before? Yeah, so this is a very common point for Sam Harris. Most of his books are actually on the development of a moral standard that does not need God. And his idea of human flourishing is his concept by which he's going to judge actions as good or evil. Do they maximally produce human flourishing or hinder it, right? So we're trying to make moral facts and duties exist without God. The problem with this, though, is we have to make some presuppositions to justify it, right? Why is this good? In order for human flourishing to be good, we have to presuppose that humans are valuable and that I know this sounds circular, but we have to presuppose that human flourishing is good. The problem is, in the worldview that people who hold this moral view hold when it comes to evolution or views on the universe and that materialism is all that exists, it's hard to justify these as claims to hold on to. If atoms are all that exist and humans are just a mistake of random processes turning non-animate objects into animate objects, and then evolution taking forth, and we just happen to be the most evolutionarily advanced life form on this planet, maybe not even in the universe, why does that make us intrinsically valuable? Yeah.
So if you're arguing this with someone, and their belief is that there's evolution, how are you separating the idea from flourishing from just considering flourishing is evolution? Like, what's best for a field mouse and how it developed was what allowed it to flourish, but it doesn't need to be considered good or valuable, it's just what happened by selection. So how are you separating flourishing in this case as something that's valuable and good from other species where it's just a matter of happenstance?
Yeah, so the question is, how do you separate the idea of flourishing just from the idea of what is, as in like an ought-is statement, what is the product of Darwinian evolution, right? The species that survives and replicates the most flourishes, right? Is that the statement? And the answer is, I don't think you can separate it. That's kind of the contrary point that they hold, right? If I believe that creation happened because of Darwinian evolution and random processes that turned inanimate matter into life, and then that life through random processes turned into sentient beings such as us, there is no reason that humans are necessarily more valuable than anything else. And in fact, there are a bunch of people who don't necessarily agree that human flourishing is good. This is true when you talk about resources, right? So what's some of the problems with human flourishing? So some of the problems what happens when there are limited resources, BWs between humans and endangered species? Yeah.
Can we go back to the humans are valuable presupposition there?
Yeah.
Couldn't the opponent argue that value is subjective? So humans are valuable to humans being human. Being you are a human, you're going to consider humans valuable. But that's subjective. It's not, humans don't have an objective value, it's a subjective value. To a bear, a human isn't valuable. So a bear could be a human, and that would be within its
Yeah.
evolutionary function. But because humans, being humans, think that humans are valuable, humans would be upset by that bear eating that human and might even retaliate against that bear for eating that human. So if you go with value as well as morality being subjective, then that doesn't really have to be like that's just part of that argument.
I like it. That's perfect. So I'm repeating things because of the recording, because I have a mic and you guys don't. And so if you've listened to any of these, it sounds like I'm talking to myself, answering questions. So yeah, the statement, which I 100% agree, is that the idea that humans are valuable at all is a subjective statement. It's only to the subject, the human, and maybe sometimes the bear, that I think humans are valuable. If I'm a bear, it might be because I want to eat the human. If I'm a human, it might be because I like that human or he might do something for me. But we certainly all know of times where there are humans as a subject who don't value another human across from them. That's why people get murdered, right? That's why bad things happen, human to human, in violence.
But as a species, we are humans, so we think humans are valuable.
And that's
so
not...
we would be upset about a human murdering another human.
That is an overgeneralization, I'll say, in that there are extraordinary examples where humans, as a race, do not all agree that we should be upset at other humans perishing, right? So there's some really big examples where that doesn't hold true, which we'll go into next. That I'll title, which humans are we worried about flourishing, right? So that we'll go into next. So the fact that humans at all are valuable is true. It totally comes into question. In fact, you know this all the time when it comes to people who are worried about the environment or people who kind of look at Mother Earth as a deity, that there's intrinsic value in nature, in other species, more so than in humans. In fact, they would view someone who says human flourishing is the metric by which we should, is the goal by which we should judge actions, as being a speciesism. As you're favoring this species, it's almost like being a racist, right? You're just preferring your species over all these other species. You know, we all just are the products of Darwinian evolution, and you don't have the right to, right, take this forest from these birds just because you have the power to, right? That all living things are equal. So there's a lot of question on whether or not this is even a valid claim that humans are valuable. There are a lot of people that don't agree with this at all, right? The biggest question, or the biggest problem I have with this that you need to really keep your ears open to is the idea of which humans are flourishing. It's almost a travesty how much people in my age group and younger learn so little about the atrocities of the 20th century. Okay? So, in a very short amount of time, under just 3 individual rulers, over 100 million people were murdered. And there wasn't a single argument made for the murder of those 100 million people that wasn't based on the idea of human flourishing. Nobody sets out to commit mass atrocity without making a reasonable argument for it. And it's almost always based on human flourishing. The question just becomes, which humans? And if my only concern is the general statement of human flourishing, I can say, well, human flourishing as a species over time. If I get rid of these people in society, we'll have more resources, society will be stronger, we'll live longer into the future. We will actually make more humans over time that have better life experiences. We will maximize the good for humans in sum total over all time. If I murder these people now, it'll be worth it because over time I will make the good maximal.
You sound like Thanos.
Okay, this is exactly the Thanos argument. But what the youth of today don't realize is that Thanos was a real person and murdered lots and lots of people in the last century in 3 different countries, right? Mao, Stalin, and Hitler. This is the argument. This is the argument for communism. This is the argument for murdering all the dissidents under communism, because they're what's holding us back from achieving the utopia. And if only we can achieve the utopia, then all humankind will flourish forever in much better ways. And of course, the ends justify the means, right? This is why we are murdering Jews, because the Jews were holding back our society. And our society could be better. In fact, we would flourish as the world. If only we could take over the whole world and murder all the Jews and all the impure races and have the one pure Aryan race, humankind would flourish into eternity. There would be less suffering. There would be less want and need. Resources would be better off. There wouldn't be any of these impure people holding us back from being our best, right? These arguments are made in the idea of human flourishing. And if you don't think that it's going to come back, it's coming back right now. Do you not think that you could see someone making the argument within 100 years with global warming? If we don't stop our carbon footprint, we will go extinct. So in order to maximize human flourishing throughout time, we should kill half the people living now, like Thanos. You couldn't make that as a rational argument if my goal was to maximize human flourishing over all time? Oh, and if I'm going to kill half the people, why would I kill them at random? Why wouldn't I want to kill the dumbest and those with deformities and those who have less mental capacity? Because if I'm worried about human flourishing, of course, if I keep the best of us, then future human generations will have less suffering. They'll have more goods. We'll have more better medicines. You'll have more human flourishing over time. So I need to kill half of us to keep us from going extinct. And if I'm going to kill half of us, I might as well keep the best half of us so that when we do figure stuff out, there'll be less suffering, less want, less need. We'll have maximum flourishing in the future, right? This isn't necessarily good by itself. So it scares me that a lot of the secular big heads in society now are arguing this idea of human flourishing, right? Because it depends on how you define flourishing and which humans are we talking about flourishing, right? So keep your ears open for that. It's not a new idea, and it's been used as the guise throughout time to commit mass atrocities. There's not a single mass atrocity that was committed that wasn't proposed to the people who participated in the mass atrocity, that this is actually better for everybody if we do this mass atrocity. It's how mass atrocities are done by ordinary people. They have to think it's for the greater good, or they wouldn't do it. Okay, that's my soapbox for the evening. Yeah. This is arguably why abortion is okay now. You can see that argument, right? Which humans getting the chance to flourish? This is the argument that's always made. Well, I was going to go to school and I wanted a career and, right? That's human flourishing. The question just is, which human gets a chance to flourish? So, the other argument that falls apart is the idea that moral facts and duties can be produced whatsoever by societies. So there's the subjective morality that's being discussed today where secular thinkers are trying to establish a set of rules and assumptions by which they can build a moral framework. That's kind of what we just covered. The other idea is that a moral framework can be built through the process of evolution. So we'll call this, again, going back to last week, I'm using evolution in the common term. When I say evolutionary morality, I kind of mean like Darwinian evolution, right? That it gets more complex and better through the evolution of societies. And the argument here is that somehow the mechanisms of Darwinian evolution have the ability to make us more moral over time. Like the stock market, yeah, maybe we have some crashes, right? Maybe that's the 1920s and 30s, but generally over time, we're figuring it out. We're so much better off now than in the 1950s when they had segregation and gay people couldn't get married. And the 1950s were so much better than like the Dark Ages when slavery and rape and murder were so much more common, right? Okay, there's some correlation there, right? I might agree that maybe we're discovering and building moral truths into our societies more as time goes on. But can I rationally hold that what is produced through evolutionary means is actually better or worse? So let's take the original example from the start of the class, right? If the society that flourishes most is the society that exhibits the best morals, then the best morals are just those of the society who flourishes most. And I think what you boil down to is what I wrote in my notes as morality by force. If you think about what we learned about evolution last week, right? Those who survive and replicate most are whose traits get passed on. And by getting passed on, we deem those traits best fit, right? When it comes to morality, the evolutionary idea of morality states that if the Nazis won World War II and took over the world, and there wasn't anyone left to disagree, then their way of thinking would have been moral, right? The idea that the most popular morality of the time is the true morality, you've really lost the definition of moral, right? It's just what's most popular isn't what's right. And we can look at countless civilizations along the way to prove that fact, right? If it goes back to the very beginning, the idea of moral realism. There are things that are right and wrong, whether or not there are people left who believe that that thing is right or wrong, right? So if we go back to the idea of Thanos murdering half the population, and that half the population that is deemed the unwanteds, if that happens, and a couple generations from now, that's all that's ever taught, and that's all that anyone thinks, would it still be okay to just discard the baby with the cleft palate because it's got a cleft palate, right? And we would all say, obviously no, but this is what you're left, you are affirming that if you go with the evolutionary theory of morality thing. Because what wins out is what's best, definitionally, in evolutionary theory. Everybody good with that question? Yeah.
So what if you have somebody that comes to you and says, well, what makes God's morality any just as subjective? I mean, because he's just doing what you're saying other people are doing, he's just forcing it. Right?
Yes. So the statement is, okay, I understand everything you've said, but how is supposing God exists and using him as a standard for morality any different? Isn't he just now the subject for subjective morality? What he says goes. Isn't that just subjective morality from a super subject that I'm just letting be a tyrant over me? Is that basically it? We're going to flesh that out over the next half hour, but basically the answer is yes. Because he's perfectly good. The mistake in that statement is the misconception of God and what God is like, right? Buried in the statement kind of implicitly, I think everyone hears it this way, and I've definitely heard it said this way from atheists, is the idea that God's just a dude who's full of spite and he's irrational and it's too humanized, right? It's not a humble enough, or it's not an appropriate view of what we believe God to be. So I'm glad you brought that up. That's a perfect segue. That's going to take us right into the Euthyphro dilemma, God, and then pain and suffering. So everybody good with objective, subjective, morality, the moral argument? So I don't know if I did a good enough job, but I think if you were to go take some time and listen to a bunch of lectures on this, what you really come down to is it's a tall task to say that there is such a thing as morality at all, if you do not subscribe to that there is a theistic God. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be a Christian God. We had arguments for Christianity last week. But if you don't believe that a God exists and he assigns or is the standard by which we measure good and evil, I don't think there's a way you can come up with a standard for morality that isn't just, it only holds true if you can win the war so that you're the one that lives, right? Because you might say, well, I have a good standard for morality, and I might just stab you in the throat and say, well, there goes his idea, right? I mean, that's basically what it comes down to. All right, so here's the other very ancient but also still common today misconception of God fallacy that you're going to get. This is called the Euthyphro dilemma. Euthyphro dilemma. God commands it because it is good. Or it is good because God commands it. So this is a dilemma that's been around since Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, Socrates, Aristotle, all the big names that all you guys know. There's still a lot of argument about all this. But from the theistic perspective, from a Christian, and I might also say Jewish or Islamic perspective of God, with a solid understanding of what we mean by God, both of these are wrong. So the first one's wrong because it puts an outside standard higher than God. God commands it because it is good. So if you read into that sentence, you can imagine God standing there looking at a list of rules and saying, oh, well, I can only command what fits into that list of rules because they're good, right? So intrinsically you're making a standard of good that is above God, that God has to subject himself to in order to command things. That's heretical to us, right? If there were a standard for goodness higher than God, that standard is what we would call God, right? God is the ultimate standard of goodness. Okay, so what about the second one? It is good because God commands it. This is closer for us. In a way, I could see this being true, but again, it becomes with how you read this. What's the implication? And what generally people are implying when they say statements like, well, how is it any different if God's the standard, he's just a tyrant subjecting his morality on me, is that it makes the righteousness of God sound arbitrary and capricious, right? Like, it is good arbitrarily just because God commanded it, right? You're kind of disconnecting the real answer. And I think what we have to affirm to, and I know Mike agrees with this, so this is doctrine for I think almost all Christians, is that both of these have it wrong. And the way I'll write it is God is, and I might even say, the good. In fact, the way the Bible would put it in Hebrew is God is righteousness. Good is God's nature. All the things that we have a hard time describing as good, just, loving, kind, patient, self-sacrificial, prudent, temperate, the ability to withhold desires, right? All these ancient ideas of virtues, you know when something's good, but you can't really put your finger on it, right? Righteousness is God. God is righteousness. They are either sides of an equal system. It's an identity. It's a logical identity. You can put them in either way. X equals X in math terms, right? And this puts it in its proper context. So this is really the answer to, well, why does giving morality with God's view of morality as the standard any better than anybody else? Like, why is it? Because what you perceive in your heart, even if you don't believe in God, as good and evil, is an outflow from God. It's written on your heart to know what is right and wrong, because you were created in the image of God, even if you don't recognize the fact that you were created in the image of God, right? So this is an important thing to really get in context, right? We learned a lot about the attributes of God in class 1, and I left out one major attribute that comes from the Euthyphro dilemma. Did everybody have this? And that is omnibenevolence. So when you look through the Bible and you start pulling out, what are the characteristics of God? We learned a lot of them in class 1, spaceless, timeless, very powerful. So we called them omnipotent, omniscient, transcendent, omnipresent. He's outside time. The one we didn't cover on purpose is omnibenevolent. And this is what stems from the moral argument, from the belief that there are moral facts and duties, that they do truly exist outside of your and my opinion, that there is an objective external standard by which all things are measured as good or evil, and that is what we call God. This is where omnibenevolent comes from. God is all loving, right? All the things that you've heard, right? He's all loving. He's patient, kind. Most importantly, to the next part of the discussion, just. He is the standard for justice. He is righteousness. This also means he wants the best for all mankind. Humanism is true. It's just taught from a totally wrong perspective, right? There is a purpose for mankind. Mankind is valuable. It's just through a different perspective than the naturalistic or materialistic worldview. So I have some verses here that I'm going to skip over. I'll read some of them, right? So, omnibenevolence, right? Psalm 145, verse 17. The Lord is righteous in all his ways and kind in all his works. John 1 John chapter 4, verse 8. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. 2 Peter 3:9. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient towards you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. Romans 2:4. Or do you presume on the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? He wants the best for all mankind. He is humanism, about human flourishing, but it's human flourishing with the perspective of eternity, right? The best for all mankind is a loving relationship with God. It is the picture of the garden when you look at the Bible, right? God's idea for the best for all mankind is the heaven and the earth being together and humans living with God in harmony and in a loving relationship. We lost that in the garden, and then if you look at the new heavens and the new earth coming together in Revelation, that's heaven coming back down to the new earth and humans getting to live with Jesus again in a loving relationship together, right? That is what's best for us. So that's the purpose. Okay? This takes us to the idea of the true human. So humanism is true if you have the perspective of the true human. I'm not going to write this to save time, but one of the biggest problems with the idea of which humans get to flourish, or a lot of what is talked about nowadays, group identity, all the stuff we're dealing with now, all the stuff that existed in the 20th century that led to the atrocities I ranted and raved about, is the lack of perspective that humans are what's eternal, right? We know from the truth of Christianity that humans are eternal. Dying is crossing over, and you don't annihilate. We just learned this in the sermon, right? You don't cease to exist. You're eternal with one of two destinations. It's your eternality that makes each individual person the most important thing relative to the society, the institution, the state, the whatever, right? The world is temporary. The human being is eternal. And this is where you get the idea of the individual human being the most important thing. If we do another week, this is where you get the idea that the individual person is sovereign, right? That these rights are inalienable is because the human is eternal and the worldly things are temporary. So if you have the true perspective that humans are eternal, that worldly institutions and societies are ephemeral, they pass, they come and pass, right? All governments have come and gone, the Roman Empire has come and gone, America will come and go, right? Even if you die tomorrow, you will exist in eternity longer than America, the country, exists. Therefore, you, the outcome of you, is more important than the outcome of America, the country. Because you, as a person, will exist far beyond it, right? So with that perspective, the true greatest good is communion with God eternally. And that's why when we go back to the human flourishing argument, this is where you get to the idea that the best way for human flourishing is freedom for the individual to follow God's laws, because we know that God's laws free us and lead to our most flourishing. They lead to our best life here, and they lead to our best eternal life in relationship and love with God, right? So that's the true human flourishing thing. I wanted to go on that sermon for a little bit. Okay, so this takes us to pain and suffering. Did I lose anybody? I'm jumping around a little bit. This is probably the roughest week for sure, but everybody good?
Yep.
Shake it out. Pain and suffering. So, before I go there, sorry to make you erase. So we just covered omnibenevolent, right? God is all loving. Most, including in that he loves all of us, wants the best for each individual. He wants everyone to come to repentance and come to relationship with him, right? So that's omnibenevolence. He's also omniscient. So you read this as omniscience. This is all-knowing. So this is perfect knowledge. Knowledge that transcends time. So how do we rationally square these two things in the world? Well, first, hopefully I established in the first hour that you can't even declare something as evil rationally without God as a measurement for good or evil. But we'll forgo that. How do you square the existence of love and evil? So, God is all loving and desires a relationship with everyone. But in order to have a true loving relationship, that love has to be freely given. We all know intrinsically that if you coerce someone into loving you, or if you force someone into loving you, that that's not really true love, right? If you're married, you know that love is a choice. It has to be freely given for it to classify as true love, right? So I think it can be rationally argued that to have a true loving relationship with God, we have to have free will. At least some amount of free will at some times. That's the little doctrinal thing. At least some of the time, you have to have free will, right? But free will also gives humans the ability to reject God's love. It's the rejection of God's love, the turning away from God, that we see as evil, right? So not only is he all-loving, but his omnibenevolence is where you get the justness in the world, the measure of good. And so turning away from his love is also how we get evil in the world through our fallen nature and free will. So these go hand in hand. Because in order to have love, we need free will. And free will is also how you end up with evildoers. Because you can freely choose to not move in the direction of God, right? So these are tied together through free will. Free will also is rationally necessary, per the sermon last week, for justice, for there to be just punishment. You have to be able to be held accountable for your decisions and actions, right? So in some respect, you have to have free will to have chose otherwise to be held punishable for your actions. And that's where these two tie together. And then the other thing I was thinking about this because of the sermon. So, okay, well, how does God use evildoers then? If he doesn't cause evil, and you're still held accountable, Judas, right? Yet God uses you in his plans. That's where this idea of omniscient comes in. So omniscient is perfect knowledge. And this is perfect knowledge of all things, even prior to creating the universe, right? God transcends all time, sees all time at the same time, right? We kind of cover this. I know this kind of blows your mind, but we have to understand before he even, and this is the analogy I like, it kind of falls apart in some respect, but before God created the universe, he's sitting in front of the VHS player. He's got a whole stack of VHSs, the old tapes, and those are different universes he could make, right? So he knows what could happen. He knows what the entire realm of possibilities are. So he knows what he's got to select from, which is an infinite amount of possibilities. That's could. He knows what would happen if he were to choose to play any of the VHSs. And then once he does play a VHS, he perfectly knows what will happen in that VHS, right? So before he even kicked the Big Bang off, which we learned in class 1, he knew Judas was going to exist and betray Jesus at some point in the distant future because he's outside of time, right? So he sees all things. He might have had a whole bunch of different options he could have chose from, and he picked the VHS, and so he foreknows all the evil things that are going to happen without necessarily causing them to happen, right? He has perfect knowledge without a causal relationship, and that's how you still have free will and are still held accountable for your evil acts. One second. So the other non-perfect analogy I'll use, perfect knowledge does not require causal relationship, right? God could be, imagine God as the world's best weatherman who knew perfectly what the weather was going to be in any city in the world, 5 days from now. Oh, it's going to rain 2.2 inches and be exactly 47.5 degrees in Greece next week. He has perfect knowledge, but he's not that weatherman. So in this case, God's just the weatherman. He's not causing the weather to actually happen that way. He just has perfect knowledge that it's going to happen that way. So he's not causing the weather, but can still have perfect knowledge of it, right? Yes, John.
Where does God's omnipotence fit in with this? Him being all-powerful. Because an all-powerful God would indeed control the weather. He would indeed direct every single one of those VHS tapes. He would direct every scene in those VHS tapes. He would control the actors' emotions in those VHS tapes. He would be the director in that. So where does the omnipotence of God fit in with this?
Okay, so the question for the audience at home is, where does God's omnipotence fit in? So the omnipotent God would control the weather in Greece while also perfectly knowing what the weather was going to be. He would control all the actions. This is the paradox that requires humility that Mike was referring to. Part of God's omnipotence, so omnipotence being omnipotent, meaning all-powerful, is also, part of his omnipotence is his ability to not act in any one instance if he chooses not to, right? He is all-powerful in his ability to do anything and also to not influence things, right? Because that is also a part of your power, which you recognize if you're a parent. You can watch your child do something and choose not to intervene, or you could choose to intervene. The part of your power is the free choice. This is the paradox that you cannot square. You do not know, of course, God had the ability to create the universe and create free creatures. We cannot deny him the ability to step in at any moment and make non-free creatures take over your actions or influence your actions in a way that you can't help. In fact, we even see passages in the Bible that we're all familiar with where that is the fundamental claim, right? God's irresistible grace, right? The paradox is that you can never know at any given moment whether you're in control or he's going to take control, and so you always have to act as though you're 100% in control. You know what I mean? That's the hard part. There is no squaring. It is a paradox, right? God could choose to be the deistic God and kick the universe off going with laws of nature in place and sustain the laws of nature, and then chose to not do anything. Now, we think there's evidence that that's not the case because of Jesus and miracles and special revelation and him talking to the prophets, right? So we don't think that that's the case. But you don't know in any one moment whether he's going to step in and take care of it for you or not, right? It's the paradox. The idea of free will and omnipotence have to be held simultaneously, and you can never square them. It is the hard part. So, and that's the rub. I don't know. Maybe I'm making it more confusing for everybody, but does everybody get what I'm saying? Like, It's heretical to deny God the power to step in and make me say the next word perfectly, right? Like the Holy Spirit can speak. But I also believe the Holy Spirit's helping me in my free will to say what's right, even though I believe I'm doing it under my own free will, right? And you can't ever suss out how much of one is happening at any one time. So,
Kevin DeYoung does a really good job of explaining those different types of God's will and how He intervenes in your life versus the choices, like you said, of the Holy Spirit being the one that's in, your backseat driver. I think he talks about, I can't remember the exact terms, but splits up God's will for your life in those manners, and that kind of helps a little bit with what you're trying to define there.
right. Right, and God's omnipotence works in mystical ways, just like the Holy Spirit does, in that, I used to not believe in divine providence. I do now. I believe divine providence is how God uses evildoers in His plan. He's got perfect foreknowledge that bad things are going to happen, that bad people are going to do bad things. By bad people, I mean we're all bad, so we all do bad things. But that He has perfect foreknowledge that's going to happen, so He can still weave that into His plan. And that's mysterious how that happens, right? He knew Judas was going to be there and betray Jesus, and He needed somebody to do that to fulfill the prophecy. Yet at the same time, Judas is held accountable, and we know from Paul's epistles that by no means is God the one who causes you to sin, right? So there is this paradox where God does not causally force you to sin. You have to hold that you have the ability in any given moment to choose otherwise, right? And that's 1 Corinthians 10:13, right? Yet, He uses it all for the greater good, right? And that's the mystery, the paradox of the two. So the comment from the back a second ago was Kevin DeYoung has a good podcast or sermon on...
Most of everything is about this, but God's will.
God's will.
Divine will.
God's divine will, Kevin DeYoung. In the front.
I was just going to throw out something simple and say, again, we're trying to break this down. And if we're talking from a point of view from God, that's God. I'm not going to try to understand that point.
Yes. Perfect segue. So the comment from the front was, this is a moment for humility, which is actually kind of next in my notes. It's a perfect segue. Humility is generally, the lack of humility is the error of the secularist or the atheist. It's a poor perspective on our understanding of God and then a lack of humility. And that's perfect way to jump into the final segment, which is now finally pain and suffering. If you're going to be a Christian in the modern world and have any desire to talk to other Christians or people of different faiths or secular people, atheists, etc., this is the topic you should spend the most time being well versed in, because this is where most people's fundamental issues lie. And these are the hardest, most nuanced discussions. So, it's pretty easy from a logical perspective to square evil existing in the world. Again, I think we need God to even claim evil exists, but if we give the idea of good and evil, free will amongst mankind can pretty easily account for evil actions, right? Well, men are free, which means they're free to choose good or evil. people sometimes choose evil, so you have evil. But the more general terms of pain or suffering go far beyond the idea of people being evil to you. You know, children dying of disease, natural disasters, your mom dying young of cancer while you're a young child. These aren't the result of evil, right? These are just general, what are referred to as gratuitous suffering. How do we square pain and suffering? So I'm going to build, there are two sides to every coin. Covered this in the introduction of class 1. There's an intellectual side and an emotional side. I'm going to try to build an intellectual argument why these things are part of God's love for us, right? So again, we have to have the correct perspective on God's desire for us and our eternal nature, right? So pain and suffering, they provide some important things for us. One, they provide contrast to us. I think these are all things that are necessary for you to grow in understanding and in relationship with God that aren't necessarily provided by evil. If there were only evil in the world, by that I mean evil acts of other free people, you can actually be led astray. Has anyone ever had an evil act done to them where your most initial and strongest reaction is hatred, revenge, bad things? Right? Okay. So you can imagine if all you had was evil, you might not be drawn into the best of dispositions that God wants you in, if we go back to this idea of moral realism, right? You know, what does the Bible call us to do when people do evil acts to us? The hardest things. Forgive, right? Forgive. Love our enemy as ourself, right? That's not what naturally happens to us with evil. And I don't think necessarily we would get humility or perspective or relinquishing of self-control if all we had was evil acts by other people. Pain and suffering offer us these things. So what we have to consider is, what would happen if we didn't have any pain and suffering or evil? Would that actually be better? So we only have a few examples of people who had a life entirely free of evil or pain or suffering, and they're batting 1,000 for, in their pride and lack of humility, deciding that they don't need God. So that would be Lucifer and Adam and Eve. So if we have our only examples of people in a perfect world, right? True utopia. All examples that we have of people who were not exposed to pain and suffering or evil abandoned God. So now if we take the perspective that we're an eternal being and our greatest good, maximal goodness for us is eternal relationship with God and a loving relationship, can we logically say that it's an impossibility that God would allow pain and suffering for a greater good? And I don't think you can. So that's the logical argument. So the logical argument goes like this. It is logically possible for God to allow a world with pain and suffering. He would only need sufficient moral reasons to allow the pain and suffering. So the sufficient moral reasons for pain and suffering would be the fact that through pain and suffering, we are drawn closer to Him and therefore achieve maximal goodness to eternity, right? These are temporary and finite I know this sucks, but like, yeah, life is temporary. Pain and suffering is temporary. And we hear this from Paul too, right? Who got to see the third heaven, by that, just real heaven, not the clouds, not the stars, the real heaven, third heaven. And, found that this temporary pain and suffering was insignificant due in comparison to the weight of glory, right? So,
Could you read that again, or say that again, that it's logically possible?
yeah. So, what you'll find in debates between atheists and Christians who talk about this, or who talk about the existence of God at all, is if there is a God that allows babies to die of cancer, then I don't want to worship him anyway, right? So the logical mistake there is the assertion that it's impossible for God to have sufficient moral reason to allow pain and suffering, right? Logically, this is, we go back to the idea of logical versus emotional arguments. You would have to argue that it's impossible for God to have a sufficient moral reason to allow the pain and suffering we see in this world for him to not be good anymore, right? For an atheist to say, like, God can't be good. If God exists, he sure as heck ain't good, because look around you. You've all heard forms of this argument before. What they're saying, if you break it down into this logical syllogism, is that it is impossible for there to be a sufficient moral reason for him to allow pain and suffering. And what I'm saying today is that the sufficient moral reason is when you hold the true human being in its appropriate perspective as an eternal object, right? We're going to exist forever, and therefore a plainly sufficient reason for allowing pain and suffering would be for our eternal benefit of being with him forever, right? Now, how do you sometimes always see the connection? That's where it gets hard, right? So if I go back to my possibly terrible analogy of God and the VHS player prior to the Big Bang, it is possible that the world you see could be that which leads to the greatest possible amount of eternal human flourishing. That the world we exist in now is the world that leads to maximal goodness, i.e., the maximal amount of humans in eternal relationship with God in the new heavens and the new earth. It is only a lack of humility that we, with our limited perspective, would say, the world I see around me surely couldn't be the best he could do, which is what you hear in a lot of debates. Boy, if God exists, he can't be all-powerful and all-knowing, because how couldn't he have done a better job with the world than what we see? And that is purely hubris, right? It is totally possible that what he is allowing to happen is what brings the most people throughout time to relationship with him for eternity, right? I trust that he is maximizing human flourishing. Human flourishing as defined as relationship with him forever, right? So allowing people to suffer temporarily in order to bring the maximal number of them into loving relationship with him could be viewed as an analogy to German citizens lying to Nazi troopers when they are asked if they were hiding Jews in their basement, right? You don't know, lying we would generally refer to as something not good, but in this instance it would be better to lie for the greater good of safely hiding the Jews in your basement, right? You can kind of view it as something like that. Now, that's a bad analogy for a very important reason that I don't want to leave you with heresy. The reason that that's a bad analogy is because it kind of implies that our temporary suffering is unjust, which it's not. Okay? So, the German citizen lying to the Nazis, asking if they've got Jews hiding in their basement, we would normally look at the act of lying as an amoral thing, but it's worth the small amoral thing because of the greater moral thing of saving the Jews in the basement. You guys get that? So where that analogy breaks down is, it's not amoral for God to temporarily allow us to suffer and experience pain because we deserve it, right? Because we are fallen and because we have all committed acts of unrighteousness. So that's where it's not a fair analogy. It would be just of God to let us be filled with pain and suffering forever, right? That's what divorce from God forever looks like. So that's where I didn't want to, they're not perfect analogies, but it's a good way to think about it, right? So that's my argument for pain and suffering is it's necessary. So that leaves us with the emotional objections to that logical argument I just made from you. So I should have wrote it down. It'll be in the notes. I forgot to send you the notes from last week, so I'll send you both. So everything's in the notes here. So the logical argument is, if God exists and allows, he only needs sufficient moral reason to allow pain and suffering. And that sufficient moral reason could be that it's necessary to bring us into an eternal relationship with him, right? So what are the emotional objections? We kind of already went over a bunch of them. What you hear from atheists most often is, God is petty and jealous and hot-headed. God's a tyrant. Why is God's morality being pushed down on me? God commits mass genocide and commands evil from his followers. If God was real, why couldn't he find a better way to make the world? And no God could be all good and all powerful and allow blank, fill in the blank, right? The problem with all of these emotional objections, so these are all emotional objections. By emotional, I mean, when you read all of these specifically, there is no logical claim that God does not exist. It's just that if he exists, I don't like him, right? So the problem here is all of the emotional objections stem from an inaccurate understanding of God. So what we learn when we dig into the scripture is a true perspective on the spiritual and the infinite versus the worldly and the finite, right? When you truly get the right perspective of God as the creator and the sustainer of all things, and the fact that people are eternal, it puts a different perspective on God pulling someone from the worldly side to the spiritual side, right? If you don't actually die, right, you're not annihilated, right? There is no annihilation. We heard that this week in the sermon. So you're actually just being pulled to your final destination, like that movie, Final Destination. Is that actually wrong for God to do at any moment? Like, are you owed a specific amount of time in the physical universe if you're never annihilated, right? Is he well within his rights as the creator of all things, sustainer of all things, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, to decide to pull you over into the spiritual realm and decide which bin to put you in, right? You're not ceasing to exist. He's just pulling you from one side to another. So a lot of the emotional arguments you hear from atheists is because they still don't view humans as eternal, right? Like they're still taking it from the standpoint of, when someone dies, that they're getting annihilated and they're not existing anymore. And how can that be fair? But that's not the true perspective. And it goes back to this idea of a standard. By what standard is God wronging you? None of these emotional arguments give logical rationale for God not existing. They just say, well, if he exists in the manner in which you say, I don't like it, Does he have to give you what you want? If he's the determiner of the purpose of life, then is the purpose of life for you to be comfortable and you to be not wanting? Right? I mean, why do you get to decide if God exists? Is a total lack of humility in the understanding of what the word God means. He is God. He's not just your king, right? Like he's not the president of a bigger country up in the sky. He is God holding the atoms of your body together, right? And making the forces of nature work. So I think most of the secular emotional complaints about the moral stuff with God and pain and suffering just come from a total hubris and lack of perspective on what we as theists see God as, right? The awe-inspiring nature of God. So, two last real quick things. Not that I intend to preach, but this is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently for stuff in my own life, and we've been talking about it in my group a little bit. So with all we learned tonight, one little sucky thing I'll leave you with is that there is no such thing as righteous anger towards God, right? If you read the notes over and you conceptualize everything that we went over tonight, it is impossible for you to be righteously angry at God. If you're angry at God, it's because you're not thinking clearly and you don't have the right perspective, right? What does anger imply? That God has wronged you. God can't wrong you, right? It's a switch of importance. You are not putting God in the appropriate place, right? It's a lack of humility. I'm not saying we don't all get angry at God. I'm not saying I haven't gotten extraordinarily angry at God. I'm just saying you can't be righteously angry at God. It's an impossibility if you understand everything that we reviewed tonight. He wants the best for you eternally. So you have to understand that your perspective in the moment is not God's perspective. And this stuff is really hard, and you should lean on your Christian brothers and sisters to help you through this. But it doesn't mean he doesn't love you. And the natural response sometimes is anger, but it's not the good response. So don't wallow in your anger for too long, because it just leads to not good things. The other thing I wanted to cover a little bit, but I think I'll leave it to you guys to investigate a little bit on your own. A lot of the highfalutin comebacks, highbrow comebacks against the morality of God come from the Bible. So often it's pointing to the genocides in the Bible, right? So Joshua slaying the Canaanites after coming into the promised land and leaving Moses, Saul and the genocide of the Amalekites. How can God be moral and command genocide and affirm? And these are good questions. I mean, they're questions that you can't just scoff off. You can't say, well, God really didn't command this, or, that was really Samuel commanding Saul, and Samuel might have not been saying God's words, but now that brings into question Samuel as a prophet, right? Like, don't do any of that. There are a ton of good articles that go into putting context around those events, putting context around the different people groups that are involved, like who are the Amalekites? Why was God commanding destruction upon them? What's the history between them and Israel for 500 years, which the Amalekites have a 500-year history with. Same with the Canaanites. Like, why did God want the destruction of the Canaanites? It's important because going back to the humility thing, we can look at something like the Holocaust and say, man, how would God allow the Holocaust to happen? Or the same, with these Amalekites and Canaanite genocides. I'm not in a place where I think I can put it past God to say that it wasn't worthwhile in the eternal nature to have the Holocaust there as a black obelisk in history to say, this is what happens when your society abandons God and godly morals, right? If you look at the societies that led to the 100 million deaths in the 19th century, or in the 20th century, all of them were in the turning away from religious morals from God, right? It was Nazism and communism, both staunchly not religious-based societies, right? I wouldn't say that it was evil of God to use the Amalekites and the Canaanites in that era as obelisks to say, this is what happens eventually to your society if you turn away from God, right? You have to logically argue that there's no sufficient moral reason for God to say, destroy the Amalekites. And there could very well be a totally sufficient reason. Like one, if you look at the history, the Amalekites were evil, so were the Canaanites. And two, allowing them to be evil and flourish for a large period of time and then totally and utterly destroy them at the hand of a God-centered society could have been very valuable in the grand picture of the eternal goodness for mankind and bringing the most people into relationship with him as an example of how not to be a society, right? So anyway, if you listen to any of the debates, you're definitely going to hear people bring up the genocides, Joshua killing the Canaanites. There's a bunch of stuff out there that you can learn about, and it changes your view when you learn the context a little bit. And it's different than Islamic jihad right now, because you'll also hear other secularists like, well, how is that different than, religious war in the Middle East right now and killing non-believers as a Muslim? And they're very different. There are more educated people than me that can give very long answers to those questions. So with that, I think we'll be done. I went over. Anybody interested in doing one more? Or everybody, raise your hand if you would have time to come next Thursday and would be interested in coming next Thursday. Okay, so we'll do one next Thursday. We have plenty enough hands. So thanks, everybody.